In a world where Africa's resources have been plundered for centuries, a young revolutionary leader has done the unthinkable. Ibrahim Traoré, the 36-year-old captain turned president of Burkina Faso, has just stopped what could have been one of the biggest modern gold seizures in African history. Reports surfaced that under the cover of debt repayment, the International Monetary Fund, backed by Western powers and even political forces tied to former U.S. President Donald Trump, sought to claim nearly 70% of Burkina Faso's gold reserves. But Traoré said no. For the first time in decades, an African leader stood up, blocked the deal, and declared, "Our gold belongs to our people, not to the IMF, not to Washington, and not to Paris." This shocking move has not only rattled the halls of the IMF, but also set off alarms in the White House, in European capitals, and among global financial elites. What does this mean for Africa, for the global economy, and for the balance of power between the global North and the global South? This is the story of Traoré's defiance, the battle over Burkina Faso's gold, and what might happen next. To understand why this confrontation matters, we first need to look at how Africa became trapped in debt in the first place. Since the 1960s, after African countries won independence, institutions like the IMF and World Bank stepped in. On paper, they offered loans to help infrastructure. But in reality, these loans came with conditions: privatization, austerity, structural adjustment programs, and massive interest rates. Over time, many African nations found themselves spending more money repaying debt than on healthcare or education. According to the African Development Bank, countries across sub-Saharan Africa spend nearly 40% of government revenue on debt servicing. And here lies the bitter irony. While Africa holds over 40% of the world's gold reserves, 90%. When African countries gained independence in the 1950s and 1960s, many were hopeful. They had natural resources in abundance: gold, diamonds, oil, fertile land, and millions of young workers ready to build new nations. The dream was that independence would finally bring prosperity to Africans themselves. But almost immediately, new chains were forged. This time, financial ones. The International Monetary Fund, IMF, and the World Bank stepped in as helpers. They presented themselves as partners, offering loans to young African nations to fund infrastructure, schools, and hospitals. On paper, it looked like support. In reality, it was a trap. These loans came with hidden conditions. They required countries to devalue their currencies, cut subsidies, and open their markets to foreign corporations. They were forced to privatize state-owned companies, often selling them off cheaply to Western investors. This system became known as Structural Adjustment Programs, SAPs. And for Africa, they were devastating. Instead of building strong, independent economies, SAPs dismantled local industries. For example, Ghana, once known as the Gold Coast, was forced to liberalize its economy in the 1980s. As a result, cheap imports flooded the market, local farmers and manufacturers collapsed, and debt only grew larger. Nigeria, one of Africa's richest oil producers, also fell victim. By the 1990s, despite exporting billions of dollars in oil, Nigeria was spending more on debt repayment than on healthcare and education combined. Ordinary Nigerians saw their living standards fall, while foreign oil companies and banks thrived. And Burkina Faso? It faced the same fate. Throughout the 1980s and 1990s, under IMF guidance, the Burkina government cut public spending and opened its gold sector to foreign companies. This meant that while gold exports skyrocketed, very little wealth actually stayed in the country. By the 2000s, the pattern was clear. Africa was paying billions in debt interest every year, yet the principal debt never disappeared. because loans were constantly refinanced, rolled over, or replaced by new ones. According to the Jubilee Debt Campaign, some African countries have already paid back their original loans several times over, yet still remain in debt due to interest. In fact, by 2023, Africa's total external debt stood at $1.1 trillion. And here is the shocking part. Countries are still paying $74 billion a year in debt service, more than what the continent receives in aid, investments, or development projects. This is why so many call the IMF system neocolonialism in disguise. Instead of armies and governors, financial contracts and interest rates keep Africa under control. It is, in effect, a resource drain. For every $1 that flows into Africa through aid or loans, more than $2 is extracted through debt repayments, profit repatriation, and illicit financial flows. And this is not just numbers, it has real. When governments spend up to 40% of their budgets repaying debt, it means fewer schools, fewer hospitals, fewer roads, and fewer jobs. In Burkina Faso, child mortality rates remain among the highest in the world, even though the country sits on billions of dollars worth of gold. The trap is designed to be inescapable. If a country defaults, the IMF cuts off future loans, international credit markets close, and the nation becomes isolated. If a country agrees to IMF terms, it sacrifices sovereignty and control over its resources. Either way, the people lose. This is the system Traoré inherited, a system where gold-rich Burkina Faso is poor not by accident, but by design. A system where Western banks profit from African debt, while African children die from poverty. And this is why the IMF's demand for 70% of Burkina Faso's gold reserves struck such a deep nerve. It wasn't just a repayment, it was the latest act in a long history of plunder, dressed up in the language of debt money. For Traoré, saying no wasn't simply about gold. It was about rejecting the entire debt trap system that has held Africa captive since independence. Burkina Faso's golden treasure. Burkina Faso may not appear on the world map as a wealthy country. It is landlocked, with no access to the sea, and it struggles with poverty, instability, and insecurity. But beneath its soil lies a hidden fortune: gold. Over the past 2 decades, Burkina Faso has quietly become one of Africa's fastest-growing gold producers. In the early 2000s, the country produced less than 10 tons of gold per year. By 2022, that figure had skyrocketed to more than 60 tons annually, making gold the single largest contributor to Burkina Faso's economy. Today, gold represents nearly 80% of the country's total export revenue. But here's the paradox. While Burkina Faso is rich in gold, its people remain among the poorest in the world. According to the United Nations, nearly 40% of the population lives below the poverty. Malnutrition is widespread, literacy rates remain low, and access to healthcare is severely limited. So where does all the gold wealth go? The answer lies in the structure of the mining industry. Most of Burkina Faso's mines are not owned by the state, nor by local entrepreneurs. Instead, they are controlled by foreign corporations. Canadian companies like Endeavour Mining, British firms, and a host of other international players dominate the sector. These companies extract gold, export it, and return only a fraction of the profits to Burkina Faso in the form of taxes or royalties. A 2021 report revealed that Burkina Faso earned less than 10% of the total value of its gold exports. The rest flowed abroad, enriching shareholders in Toronto, London, and Paris, while leaving very little for the Burkinabe people. This is not an accident. It is the result of decades of policies shaped by foreign influence and IMF recommendations. In the 1980s and 1990s, Burkina Faso was pressure. Liberalize its mining sector, offering favorable contracts to foreign companies in exchange for loans. At the time, The promise was that foreign investment would modernize the industry and boost the economy. But in practice, it created a system where the country's most valuable resource was effectively outsourced. Local communities were displaced, workers faced dangerous conditions in mines, and environmental destruction spread across regions rich in gold. Meanwhile, the government remained dependent on foreign companies and international loans. Gold, instead of being a blessing, became another form of dependency. To make matters worse, international lenders began treating gold as a collateral asset. Whenever Burkina Faso sought loans from the IMF or international banks, its gold reserves were considered a guarantee. This meant that in times of crisis, if the country struggled to repay its debts, creditors had the right to demand repayment in gold. The logic was clear from the Western perspective. Gold is stable, gold is valuable, and gold is easy to sell in global markets. For lenders, it was the perfect insurance policy. But for Burkina Faso, it meant that its most precious resource was no longer under its own control. By 2024, reports suggested that the IMF was preparing a deal that would require Burkina Faso to hand over up to 70% of its gold reserves as part of a debt repayment plan. On the surface, it was presented as a necessary measure to restore fiscal balance. In reality, it was the latest stage of a long-running pattern, Africa's resources used to pay debts that never seemed to end. This move sent shockwaves inside the country. For ordinary Burkinabe citizens who had watched their gold leave the country for decades while they remained poor, this felt like the final insult. How could it be that while the ground beneath their feet held billions in value, their children lacked schools, their hospitals lacked medicine, and their villages lacked electricity? The anger was not just economic, it was historical. Burkinabe citizens remembered how their former revolutionary leader, Thomas Sankara, had once tried to break free from Western dependency in the 1980s. Sankara warned that debt was a new form of slavery, and he called for Africa to unite against it. For that, he was assassinated in 1987, in what many believe was a plot backed by foreign powers. Now, decades later, Ibrahim Traoré was faced with the same challenge. The IMF's demand for gold was more than a financial condition. It was a symbol of the centuries-old struggle over who truly owns Africa's wealth. For Traoré, the question was simple. Would Burkina Faso allow its gold to continue flowing abroad, enriching Western institutions, while its own people suffered? Or would the country take control of its treasure and use it to build a different future? When Traoré stood before the nation and declared that Burkina Faso would not sell its gold, he was not just protecting an asset. He was making a statement of sovereignty, because in Burkina Faso, gold is more than just a mineral. It is the foundation of the economy, the heart of the people's struggle, and the symbol of a future that could finally belong to Africans themselves. Who is Ibrahim Traoré? To understand the weight of Traoré's defiance against the IMF, we need to look at the man himself. Who is Ibrahim Traoré, the 36-year-old soldier who has shaken the foundations of Western financial power? Born in 1988 in the province of Bondaku, Western Burkina Faso, Ibrahim Traoré grew up in a modest family. His childhood was not one of luxury or privilege. Like millions of Burkinabe children, he knew the harsh realities of poverty, underfunded schools, scarce healthcare, and a daily struggle for opportunity. But from an early age, he showed an unusual sense of discipline and determination. When he was accepted into the University of Ouagadougou, chose to study geology. This decision reflected his interest in the land itself, in the soil and the minerals that lay beneath Burkina Faso. Ironically, the very resources he studied as a young man, gold, manganese, and other minerals, would later become central to his struggle against foreign powers. But life soon took a different turn. In 2009, he joined the Burkina Army, enrolling at the Georges Namoano Military Academy. It was here that Traoré discovered his calling, not just as a soldier, but as a leader. Known among peers for his calm demeanor and sharp intellect, he quickly distinguished himself in training. He later served in the artillery regiment and was deployed to the north of the country, where Burkina Faso faced growing instability from armed insurgent groups linked to Al-Qaeda and ISIS. In these harsh conditions, Traoré witnessed two things that deeply shaped him. First, he saw how ordinary Burkinabe villagers bore the brunt of violence. Thousands were displaced. Schools were closed, and families were destroyed by terrorism. Second, he saw the failure of political leaders in Ouagadougou, who, despite foreign military support from France and others, could not protect their own citizens. This frustration simmered for years. In 2014, Burkina Faso had already experienced a people's uprising that overthrew longtime dictator Blaise Compaoré. In September 2022, he and his fellow officers ousted Damiba, declaring that they could no longer stand by while Burkina Faso collapsed. When Traoré first appeared on national television in his military fatigues, many outside the country dismissed him. Western media called him another young coup leader, just another chapter in Africa's cycle of instability. But within Burkina Faso, and across much of Africa, the reaction was entirely different. For many, Traoré represented something they had not seen in decades, a leader unafraid to challenge the old colonial powers. He immediately took bold steps that sent a strong message. He expelled French troops, accusing them of failing to fight terrorism effectively and of interfering in Burkinabe sovereignty. He turned instead to alternative partners, Russia, Turkey, and other nations willing to provide military assistance without imposing IMF-style conditions. But Traoré's defiance was not just military, it was ideological. He openly, the legacy of Thomas Sankara, Burkina Faso's revolutionary leader of the 1980s, Sankara, known as Africa's Che Guevara, had preached self-reliance, women's empowerment, and the rejection of foreign debt. He famously said, "Debt is a cleverly managed reconquest of Africa, to enslave it once again." For Traoré, these were not just words, they were a blueprint. In speech after speech, he emphasized sovereignty, dignity, and the need for Africans to take control of their own resources. At just 36, Traoré became the world's youngest head of state. His age was not a weakness, it was a symbol of a new generation rising. Across Africa, millions of young people, frustrated by unemployment and corruption, saw themselves in him. Social media campaigns hailed him as Africa's lion and the hope of a new dawn. Yet his rise also carried immense risk. Standing up to France, the United States, and the IMF put him in direct confrontation with some of the most powerful institutions on earth. He knew the fate of past leaders. Patrice Lumumba of Congo, assassinated in 1961. Thomas Sankara, killed in 1987. Muammar Gaddafi, toppled in 2011 after proposing an African gold-backed currency. Traoré has spoken of these risks openly. "If they kill me today, it is no problem. Others will rise after me. What matters is that Africa must be free." This fearlessness has only deepened his popularity. To many Burkinabe citizens, Traoré is not just a president, he is a revolutionary in uniform. To many Africans beyond his borders, he is proof that the spirit of liberation has not died. And so, when the IMF demanded that Burkina Faso hand over 70% of its gold reserves for debt repayment, the question was not only financial, it was personal. Would this young soldier, who had risen from poverty to power, surrender the nation's future to the same system he had vowed to resist? His answer, of course, was no. And in that refusal, he transformed himself from a local leader into